When the lawyer said, "Sir, you have no idea," Emma's father froze mid-reach across the mahogany table, his hand still outstretched toward documents that didn't belong to him. What happened next would expose a lifetime of assumptions, shatter a family's facade, and prove that some truths wait decades to surface. Emma had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the venom in her father's eyes. When the will was read aloud, "Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening." The attorney's office smelled of old leather and lemon polish, the kind of place where generations of secrets had been sealed behind closed doors. Emma sat rigid in her chair, feeling the weight of her father's presence beside her like a storm cloud ready to burst. Her brother Daniel sat across from them, eyes red-rimmed, still processing their mother's death 3 weeks prior. The funeral had been cold and formal, much like their childhood home had always been. But this reading of the will carried a tension that made the air feel combustible. "Attorney." Davidson adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. He was an older man, silver-haired and deliberate in his movements, the kind who chose every word with surgical precision. The envelope he held bore their mother's elegant handwriting, "To be read upon my passing. No exceptions." "Your mother was very specific about how this should proceed," Davidson began, his voice measured. "I'm going to read this exactly as written." Emma's father, Richard, shifted in his seat with barely concealed impatience. He'd been like this since they'd arrived, checking his watch, sighing audibly, treating the proceedings as an inconvenient formality standing between him and what he clearly believed was rightfully his. After all, he'd been married to Eleanor for 32 years. He'd put up with her eccentricities, as he called them. Her volunteer work at the Veterans Center, her late-night trips to the old farmhouse upstate that she'd inherited from her parents, her inexplicable softness toward Emma, the daughter who'd never quite measured up in Richard's eyes. Davidson began reading. The first few paragraphs were standard personal items to Daniel, some charitable donations, the summer house in Maine to be sold and proceeds divided. Then came the primary estate, the family home in Connecticut, the investment portfolio, the farmhouse, and a sum that made even Daniel's eyes widen. "To my daughter Emma," Davidson read, "I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including the family home at 847 Meadowbrook Lane, all investment accounts under my name, and the property in Hudson Valley, along with all assets contained therein." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went from pale to crimson in the span of a heartbeat. "That's impossible," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Eleanor, wouldn't we discuss this? That house is half mine. Those accounts—" "Actually, Mr. Hartwell," Davidson interrupted gently but firmly, "they're not. Your wife maintained separate ownership of all properties and accounts acquired before and during your marriage. It's all documented quite clearly." "This is insane." Richard slammed his palm against the table, making Daniel flinch. "Emma has done nothing to deserve this. She dropped out of that fancy college we paid for. She's worked minimum wage jobs her entire adult life. She barely visited her own mother in her final years. Dad, that's not—" Emma started, but the words died in her throat. How could she explain the phone calls, the weekly drives upstate that her father knew nothing about, the nights spent helping her mother organize something she'd called the project? Richard was standing now, reaching across the table toward the documents. "I want to see those papers. There's been a mistake, or she wasn't in her right mind, or—" "Sir," Davidson's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You have no idea." The lawyer's tone made everyone freeze. Even Richard's hand hovered mid-air, suspended in that moment of absolute stillness before everything changes forever. Davidson pulled out a second envelope, this one thicker. "Your wife left instructions for me to explain should this reaction occur. And she predicted, quite accurately, that it would." He looked at Richard with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Hartwell, did you ever wonder why your wife spent so much time at that farmhouse? Why she insisted on keeping it, maintaining it, visiting it every week for the past 8 years?" Richard's jaw worked soundlessly. "Your wife," Davidson continued, "ran an entire operation from that property. A sanctuary, actually, for women and children fleeing domestic violence. She used her inheritance, her own money, to renovate the farmhouse and 2 adjacent properties into safe housing. She coordinated with 3 counties' worth of social services. She personally counseled over 60 families and helped them rebuild their lives." Emma watched her father's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. And Emma, Davidson said, turning to her with warmth in his eyes, your mother's letters mention that you've been the only family member helping her with this work for the past 5 years. Every weekend, every holiday you claim to be working. You've been maintaining properties, driving families to appointments, teaching job skills workshops, counseling women who needed someone who understood. Daniel's hand flew to his mouth. Emma, you never said, Mom asked me not to, Emma said quietly, her voice trembling. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to protect the families. Keep the location private, keep them safe from anyone who might. She couldn't finish the sentence, but her eyes flickered to her father. The weight of that unspoken implication hung in the air like smoke. Davidson wasn't finished. Mrs. Hartwell's letter states that this inheritance isn't a reward, Emma. It's a responsibility. She's trusting you to continue the work. The farmhouse, the funding, the mission, it's yours now. She wrote, and I quote, Emma understands that real strength isn't in demanding respect or wielding power over others. It's in lifting up those who've been knocked down. It's in using whatever you have to make the world smaller and kinder for someone who's afraid. She knows what it means to feel small in your own home, and she's spent years making sure other women never have to feel that way again. Something broke open in Emma's chest, grief and pride and overwhelming purpose all tangled together. She remembered being 16, watching her mother flinch at her father's raised voice. She remembered being 23, finally finding the courage to move out despite his protests. She remembered her mother's quiet strength, the way she'd learned to build a life of meaning in the margins her husband allowed her. Richard slumped back in his chair, looking suddenly older. The bravado had drained from him like air from a punctured tire. I didn't know, he whispered. I never asked. I just assumed she was wasting time being sentimental about her parents' old place. You assumed a lot of things, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. About Mom, about Emma, about what mattered. The office fell quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Emma stared at the papers in front of her, seeing not just legal documents but her mother's trust, her life's purpose, being passed into her hands. She thought of the women she'd met, the children who'd learned to laugh again in the safety of those walls. She thought of her mother, working tirelessly behind the scenes, never seeking recognition, never expecting gratitude. There's one more thing, Davidson said softly. He handed Emma a sealed letter. From your mother, she wanted you to read this in private. Emma took it with trembling hands, recognizing her mother's handwriting immediately. Just seeing it made her eyes sting with fresh tears. As they left the attorney's office, Richard walked behind them in silence. On the sidewalk, in the harsh afternoon sunlight, he finally spoke. Emma, He stopped, searching for words he'd never learned how to say. Your mother was a better person than I deserved. And you're more like her than I ever gave you credit for. It wasn't quite an apology. It might never be. But it was the closest thing to honesty Emma had ever heard from her father. That night, alone in her apartment, Emma opened her mother's letter. Her words washed over her like a blessing. You never needed my money to be wealthy, sweetheart. You've been rich in all the ways that matter since you were a girl who stood up for the quiet kids at school. I'm not leaving you an inheritance. I'm leaving you a legacy. Make it grow. Make it matter. Make them safe. You already know how you've been doing it your whole life in small ways and big ones. Now you have the means to do it on a scale that can change everything. Emma folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her heart. She looked out her window at the city lights, feeling her mother's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. Tomorrow she'd drive upstate. Tomorrow she'd continue the work. Tomorrow she'd prove worthy of the trust she'd been given, because kindness doesn't vanish, it waits. And it finds its way back. And somewhere in a farmhouse full of second chances, a light was still burning in the window, just like her mother. Always kept it. Waiting. Welcoming. Home. If this story touched something in you, drop a comment below and let me know. Share it with someone who needs to hear that inheritance isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about purpose. And if you want more stories that remind us what really matters, subscribe and join this community. We're all just trying to find our way back to what's true.